1970, I spent a week in Laos, a very moving week. I happened to be in Laos right after the CIA mercenary army had cleared out about 30,000 people from the Plain of Jars in northern Laos, where they had been subjected to what was then the most fierce bombing in human history. It was succeeded shortly after by Cambodia. These are poor peasant society. Probably most of them didn't even know they were in Laos. There was nothing there. The planes were sent there because the bombing of North Vietnam had been temporarily stopped and there was nothing for the Air Force to do, so they bombed Laos. They had been living in caves for over 2 years, trying to farm at night. They had finally been driven out by the mercenary army to the surroundings of Vientiane. And I spent a lot of time interviewing refugees with Fred Branfman, who did heroic work in bringing this story finally to the American people, and saw more interesting things in Laos. Then I went to North Vietnam, where I also, as Howard had been invited by the government, but I was actually invited to teach. It was a bombing pause, a short bombing pause, and they were able to bring people in from outlying areas back to Hanoi. And the Polytechnic University, or what was left of it, the ruins of the Polytechnic University, they came and I lectured on just about anything I knew anything about. These are people who had been out of touch with faculty, students, others had been out of touch with the world for 5 years. And they asked me everything from what's Norman Mailer writing these days to technical questions in linguistics and mathematics and whatever else I could say anything about. I also traveled around a little bit, not very much, but a few days, but enough to see what Howard described, right close to Hanoi. I never got very far away, which was the most protected area, because in Hanoi there were embassies and journalists, and so the bombing, though severe, was nothing like what it was much farther away. But even there you could see the ruins of villages, the shell of the major hospital in Thanh Hoa, which had been bombed by accident, of course, areas that were just moonscapes, you know, where there had been villages in an effort to destroy a bridge and so on. So those were my 2 weeks in Laos and North Vietnam.
You were a linguistics professor at MIT at the time. Yeah. So why did you go? What drove you to, and what was the response here at home?
Well, I was able to, actually I had intended to go only for 1 week to North Vietnam, but if you really want to know the details, the UN bureaucrat in Laos who was organizing flights was a very bored Indian bureaucrat who had nothing to do, and apparently his only joy in the world was making things difficult for people who wanted to do something not untypical. And fortunately for me, he made it difficult for me and my companions, Doug Dowd and Dick Fernandez, to go to North Vietnam. So I had a week in Laos, which was an extremely valuable week. I wrote about it in some detail. But I was teaching at the time. I was to be away. It was a vacation week, and so I taught linguistics in the Polytechnic University.
What about the opposition here at home and your level of protest at MIT? What did you do?
Well, MIT was a curious situation. I happened to be working in a laboratory which was 100% supported by the 3 armed services, but it was also one of the centers of anti-war resistance. Starting in 1965, along with an artist friend in Boston, Harold Tovish, we tried to organize national tax resistance. It's 1965. Like Howard, I was giving talks, taking part in demonstrations, getting arrested. By 1966, we were becoming involved directly in support for draft resistance, helping deserters, others, and it just continued. It's worth remembering. One often hears today justified complaints about how little protest there is against the war in Iraq. But that's very misleading. And here, as Howard was saying, a little sense of history is useful. The protest against the war in Iraq is far beyond the protest against the war in Vietnam at any comparable level. Large-scale protest against the war in Vietnam did not really begin until there were several 100,000 U.S. troops in South Vietnam. The country had been virtually destroyed. The bombing had been extended to the north, to Laos, soon to Cambodia, where, incidentally, we have just learned, or rather, we haven't learned, but we could learn if we had a free press, that the bombing in Cambodia, which was known to be horrendous, was actually 5 times as high as was reported, greater than the entire Allied bombing in all of World War II on a defenseless peasant society, which turned peasants into enraged fanatics during those years. The Khmer Rouge grew from nothing, a few thousand scattered people, to hundreds of thousands, and then that led to the part of Cambodia that we're allowed to think about. That was the first war. But the real protest against the war in Vietnam came at a period far beyond what has yet been reached in Iraq. First few years of the war, there was almost nothing. I mean, so little protest that virtually nobody in the United States even knows when the war began. Kennedy invaded South Vietnam in 1962. That was after 7 years of efforts to impose a Latin American-style terror state, which had killed tens of thousands of people and elicited resistance. 1962, Kennedy sent the U.S. Air Force to start bombing South Vietnam under South Vietnamese markings, but nobody was deluded by that. Initiated chemical warfare to destroy crops and ground cover, and started programs which rounded ultimately millions of people into what amounted to concentration camps called strategic hamlets, where they were surrounded by barbed wire to protect them, as it was said, from the guerrillas who everyone knew they were voluntarily supporting. These are indigenous South Vietnamese resistance. That was 1962. You couldn't get 2 people in a living room to talk about it. In October 1965, right here in Boston, maybe the most liberal city in the country, there were then already a couple 100,000 troops there. The bombing of North Vietnam had started. We tried to have our first major public demonstration against the war on the Boston Common, the usual place for meetings. I was supposed to be one of the speakers. Nobody could hear a word. The meeting was totally broken up by students marching over from universities, by others, and hundreds of state police, which kept people from being murdered. The next day's newspaper, the Boston Globe, liberal newspaper, was full of denunciations of the people who dared make mild statements about bombing the North. In fact, right through the protests, which did reach a substantial scale and were very significant, especially the resistance, it was mostly directed against the war in North Vietnam. The attack on South Vietnam was mostly ignored. And incidentally, the same is true of government planning. We know about that from the Pentagon Papers and now many subsequent documents. There was meticulous planning about the bombing of the North. Just where should you bomb and how far should you go and so on. The bombing of the South in the internal documents is almost nothing. There's a very simple reason for it. The bombing of the South was costless. Nobody's going to shoot you down. Nobody's going to complain. You know, do whatever you want. Wipe the place out, which is pretty much what happened. North Vietnam was dangerous. You could hit Russian ships in the Haiphong harbor. As I said, there were embassies in Hanoi. People could report. You were bombing an internal Chinese railroad, which happened to pass through North Vietnam. So there could be international repercussions and costs. So therefore, it was very carefully calibrated. If you look at, say, Robert McNamara's memoirs, a lot of discussion of the bombing of North Vietnam. Virtually nothing about the bombing of South Vietnam, which even in 1965 was triple the scale of the bombing of the North and had been going on for years. Now there's a great deal more protest. Actually, one interesting illustration, I'll end with that, is Arthur Schlesinger, the perhaps best-known American historian. In the case of the war in Vietnam, in the early years, he supported it. In fact, if you read his 1,000 Days, his story of the Kennedy administration, it's barely mentioned, except just wonderful thing that's happening.